Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Mysteries and Disappearances video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's continue the wonderful book Vanished, Mysterious Disappearances by David Clark. Once again, we're into chapter 3. This will be part 2. The theme again is associated with crowds away, meaning it's dealing with the disappearances of either entire colonies or entire villages and so on. This will actually wrap up this chapter. I didn't realize how short this chapter will be, but it'll focus on two sets of disappearances. One will be a colony or a group that was called the Norfolks, and the last one is known as the Ninth Legion. So without further ado, let's go ahead and let's share this information here. I'll give my own thoughts and opinions on it. It'll be interesting to see how, once again, a large number of people ended up disappearing without a single trace. So the first one, again, is called the Norfolks. So here's what it says. A disappearance of people en masse of a far more sinister nature occurred in 1915 at Galapalo when over 200 men of the 1st 5th Norfolk Regiment vanished from sight. Galapalo, a peninsula jutting out into the Aegean Sea, is part of Turkey. The Galapalo campaign of the First World War was undertaken by the Allies to relieve the pressure on the Russian army in the Caucasus. It lasted for only 12 months from February 1915 until January 1916. Poorly led and equipped, it proved a fiasco, rivaling in ineptitude and disorganization the most disastrous initiatives of the Western Front. The main battlefield of the campaign was the Sova Plain, set against a backcloth of desolate hills. The Allies lay exposed on the plain, while the Turks were embedded in the hills. The commander-in-chief, Sir Ian Hamilton, held to a strategy throughout the campaign of mass assaults on the Turks' entrenched positions. When not engaged in these misguided forays, the Allied troops were incarcerated in trenches in conditions even worse than those prevailing on the Western Front. By way of preparation for one of the all-out assaults scheduled on the evening of August 12, 1915, the British 163rd Brigade of Territorials was ordered forward to mop up any snipers in forward Turkish positions. The 163rd, comprising the 1/8th Hampshires, 1/5 Suffolks, and 1/4 and 1/5 Norfolks, moved out with inadequate artillery cover in the late afternoon. The main body of the 163rd came under heavy machine gun fire and went to ground. However, the 1/5 Norfolks on the right of the line of advance were able to press on. What happened next was described by Sir Ian Hamilton in a report to Lord Kitchener. He said, "The fighting grew hotter and the ground became more wooded and broken. At this stage, many men were wounded or grew exhausted with thirst. These found their way back to the camp during the night, but the Colonel Beauchamp, with 16 officers and 250 men, still kept pushing forward, driving the enemy before him. Amongst these ardent souls was a part of a fine company enlisted from the King's Sandringham estates. Nothing more was seen or heard of any of them. They charged into the forest and were lost to sight or sound. None of them ever came back. 267 men had vanished without a trace." Color is added to the story by the strange tale told by a company of New Zealanders who had witnessed the occurrence. They spoke of seeing a dense, solid-looking cloud shaped like a loaf of bread settle on the ground in the path of the advancing Norfolks. The brigade entered the cloud, which, as soon as the last soldier had been seen swallowed up, rose into the sky, where in the company, where with a number of similar clouds, it then drifted away. The incident is made even stranger by the fact that but for these half-dozen or so strangely shaped clouds, the day was a clear one. Half a century later, 3 of the original witnesses to this event produced a signed statement confirming what they had seen. Skeptics have made much of 1 or 2 factual errors contained, inevitably with the passing of 50 years, in the statement. For example, reference is made to the 1/4 Norfolks instead of the 1/5, and the date of the event is given as August 21st as opposed to August 12th. One more use to critics is the acknowledgement that the whole process involving Min and Cloud took place within about 3/4 of an hour, during which time most of the brigade was lost from view. In 45 minutes, much can happen on a battlefield, and on this understanding, it is quite possible that officers and men were cut to pieces. On the Western Front, the loss of 267 infantrymen during the course of an assault would have been hardly worth mentioning. Yet the incident at Gallipoli was sufficiently curious for the British to press the Turks for their views on the matter at the conclusion of the war in 1918. The Turks denied all knowledge of the 1/5 Norfolks and were unable to produce any prisoners. Further inquiries did actually lead to the discovery of a number of bodies crudely buried by the farmer on whose land they had been found, about 120 in total. Although they were positively identified as the men belonging to the 1/5, this figure still leaves more than 140 unaccounted for. If the 1/5 Norfolks had been cut down by enemy fire during the time they were obscured from their comrades' view, it is likely that they would have fallen in a relatively confined and well-defined area. And so we have another example of a supposedly rational solution merely compounding a mystery. And then the last segment is the one that's titled The Ninth Legion, and here's what it says. The stories of the missing Norfolks and of Raleigh's lost colony are the best known of what we might term disappearances en masse. But as ever, there are others which have not achieved quite such a degree of notoriety, although the circumstances surrounding them are no less inexplicable. Running a close third is the strange tale of the Ninth Legion. The Romans never fully succeeded in subjugating the ancient Britons, and in AD 61, the occupying Roman army was badly pressed. Under Boadicea, the hitherto disorganized opposition to the invasion took on the semblance of a unified front. Against a horde of barbarians assembled by the Iceni queen, there stood only 4 Roman legions. The 2nd at Gloucester, the 9th at Lincoln, and the 14th and 12th, which at the time of the uprising were in the west, under the command of the governor of the province, Suetonius, who was attempting to subdue the Celts. Colchester bore the brunt of the initial onslaught and was burned to the ground with its Roman inhabitants and its hated British collaborators. The Ninth Legion marched out from Lincoln in an attempt to stem the revolt. Boadicea decided to meet it head-on. The Ninth was overwhelmed by the sheer weight of numbers and cut to pieces. The commander, Petrilius Cerelius, was happy to escape with only his cavalry intact. Boadicea went on to sack both London and St. Albans, but was eventually routed by Suetonius, who had made a forced march from Wales. With a disciplined force of 10,000 men, he overcame Boadicea's army of an estimated 80,000, destroying it to a man. Boadicea took prison as a preferable alternative to capture. One uprising had been quelled, but others took its place. The Iceni had traditionally been thought of as one of the more placid British tribes. One of the most warlike was the Brigantes, who continuously rose against their Roman masters. By the time of Hadrian's succession in AD 117, the Brigantes, aided by their allies the Novante from the far north, had become uncontrollable. In the year AD 121, Hadrian visited Britain personally and instituted the massive construction project which bears his name, the building of a wall 73 miles long between the Tyne and the Solway. Now, the thinking behind this resolved not so much around the need to keep out the tribes from southern Scotland as the desirability of driving a wedge between them and their Brigante allies. That this work was thought necessary may have some bearing on the sudden disappearance of the Ninth Legion. The continuous warfare waged by the Brigantes is very poorly documented, having taken place in the wilds of northern Britain, so distant from the populous and prosperous southeast. To the Ninth Legion, reconstituted and removed to York, fell the unenviable task of maintaining law and order. In their efforts to do so, it seems that a terrible fate befell them, for at about time of Hadrian's accession, they disappeared from recorded history. In what was probably the year AD 122, the York fortress was taken over by the 6th Legion, sent over from Germany for this specific task. The disappearance of their predecessors is one of the greatest mysteries of all time and has remained unsolved to this day. The most likely explanation is that the Jinx Ninth was routed by the Brigantes in much the same way the Boadicea had defeated them 50 years before. Only this time the British finished the job. Perhaps a relatively small number of Romans retained in the garrison at York escaped the slaughter which would have involved the ultimate in ignominy, the loss of the eagle, the legion's military standard and emblem. To Rome, with a civilization steeped in superstition, the knife was clearly bad medicine. No second attempt at reconstruction was made, and the knife was allowed to rest in peace. This crushing defeat was hushed up in order to avoid a general panic. The knife was simply erased from the records book. And that's it. That's everything that wraps up chapter 3 from the book Vanished Mysterious Disappearances. Once again, dealing with the theme of crowds away, in other words, large groups of people. Let's go ahead and let's talk about their disappearances. So the first one was the Norfolks. How about that? First World War. Here you had a situation where one group was essentially fighting against another group. It was known as the Gallipoli Campaign, and on it, the Allies were going against, I believe it was the Turkish or the Turks. And there they were, the Turks entrenched in some very, very hard positions, and the Allies' strategy was essentially to fight up front, like to fight en masse, to fight all at once, or as it was called, a mass assault. And so it happened on that fateful day, it looks like, on August 12, 1915, when all of a sudden the 1/5 Norfolks decided to still go forward, while the other ones who were being routed at the time, if you don't know what that means, I think that means more on the lines of being basically cut down very quickly and very brutally in a type of war. And so they decided to get back, in other words, to move away from the heavy machine gun fire that was going to them. And so, but the other ones, the 1/5 Norfolks, all 250 men and 16 officers, decided to move forward. And then that was it. They were gone. They were lost to sight and sound, as it was described. 267 men just completely gone. And what made it really, really weird, what was up with that cloud? All of a sudden, a solid-looking cloud settled in the ground right in front of them, and they all disappeared one by one into that cloud. And then, as the witnesses, 3 of them no less, stated, when that cloud went up, they were gone. They were actually gone. Who knows what happened to those men between that time period? Apparently, it was about 45 minutes or so when it came to that battlefield. And so whenever that cloud went up, it went up into the sky. And one other ways was a cloudless day that day. Very few clouds, if any. So what was up with that? But at least there was some closure. Apparently, one of the farmers there had 120 bodies crudely buried there on his farm. Who knows if he was part of that type of assault? Most likely not. Most likely he was a poor victim associated with that. Like all of a sudden there were just dead bodies around his farm. But either way, though, that still left about 140 unaccounted for. What happened with them? That is so fascinating. The idea that in the middle of a battlefield, there's a cloud that comes down, and almost like in a Silent Hill manner, they're gone whenever it disappears. It definitely still remains so mysterious. The Ninth Legion story, I didn't quite understand it. It just seems like there was a group called the Ninth Legion who were pressing, and while they did pretty well, and looks like on one campaign, taking on 80,000 men, and they had 10,000 men on their end, it turns out that they had to still care for an area, is what I thought it sounded like, that was far away from the areas that are normally populous and prosperous, as it was described. And so after that battle, they had to maintain their area with law and order, but somehow during that time, they ended up disappearing. And when that happened, it's presumed that the 6th Legion took over and caused their disappearance, but there's so little information, it's hard to say. What happened? Did they just get killed, or by the 6th Legion, or did they get killed by others? Or did they just decide to give up and just basically blend into the crowds? Who knows? There's just so little information associated with it. I can't really give much thought. But let me know what you guys and gals think. That wraps up this chapter. Next chapter is going to be focusing more again on the individuals. And in one case, it's going to be with a gentleman by the name of Lord Lucan. So I look forward to seeing that. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.